I realize the novelty of a major celebrity entering your little race, but kindly resist the temptation and keep the media coverage to a minimum. Thank you.
The headlights cut through the Nevada desert at 3 a.m., the speedometer needle vibrating past 160. There are no cameras here, no safety nets, and nobody is laughing. Most people remember the Cannonball Run as a star-studded, lighthearted comedy. But if you look past the studio-glossed laughter, there is a much colder, more unsettling reality. The movie we all got was actually a cover-up for a darker, far more dangerous beast, one the studio couldn't afford to let the world see. The Asphalt Wild West, the real outlaw run. So you have to strip away the cartoonish veneer of the 1981 movie and look at the actual asphalt where it was born to get the ghost version of the film that the studio buried. The film wasn't cooked up in a sterile writer's room on a Hollywood backlot. It was ripped directly from the illegal, highly dangerous, and completely unregulated world of the Cannonball Baker Sea to Shining Sea Memorial Trophy Dash. This wasn't some organized weekend track day with ambulances standing by and corner marshals waving yellow flags. It was a chaotic middle finger to the establishment sprint from New York City to Redondo Beach, California, executed entirely on public infrastructure. The real-life participants weren't just quirky misfits seeking a fun trophy. They were part of a highly intense, deeply competitive subculture operating completely outside the bounds of civilized society. The drivers who strapped themselves into these machines weren't lovable rogues playing for harmless laughs. They were intense, sleep-deprived, adrenaline-addicted purists pushing mechanical limits to the absolute edge. They were blasting down two-lane state highways and interstate corridors at speeds that modern traffic laws can barely comprehend. We are talking about heavy, iron-blocked American muscle cars, highly temperamental European exotics, and heavily modified vans tearing through the dark at 170 miles per hour. At those speeds, on 70s tire technology and primitive suspension setups, the margin between a legendary run and a horrific multi-car disaster was thinner than a sheet of paper. There were no roll cages in most of these vehicles, no fire suppression systems, and no modern crumple zones. A single blowout at those speeds meant certain death. The real-world tactics employed by these racers were born out of a cold, tactical desperation to evade law enforcement at all costs, and it went far beyond the movie's goofy disguises. Drivers didn't just put on fake priest outfits, they operated like paramilitary units on wheels. Some teams outfitted their vehicles with aircraft-grade switches that could completely kill the rear brake lights and license plate illumination. This allowed them to run in what they called blackout mode in the dead of night. Imagine barreling down a pitch-black, unlit stretch of interstate in rural Utah, completely invisible to anyone behind you, navigating entirely by the faint glow of military surplus night vision goggles strapped to your face. One stray deer, one patch of black ice, or one long-haul trucker changing lanes without looking, and the entire enterprise would have instantly disintegrated into a high-speed body count. The tension inside those cockpits wasn't a series of witty banters, it was a silent, sweating terror. The psychological toll on these drivers was immense. This wasn't a casual road trip with scenic stops and diner coffee. This was 30-plus hours of continuous, white-knuckle driving, fueled by massive doses of caffeine, amphetamines, and pure survival instinct. Hallucinations were common as the sun set for the second time over the Mojave Desert. Drivers regularly reported seeing phantom semi-trucks parked in the middle of the highway, imaginary roadblocks, and stretching asphalt that seemed to warp and bend under their headlights. The sensory deprivation of the night, combined with the deafening roar of an unbaffled V8 engine vibrating through the floorboards for thousands of miles, pushed human endurance to a breaking point. It was an environment of extreme stress, where split-second decisions dictated whether you made it to the Pacific Ocean or ended up wrapped around a concrete overpass. The public safety element was completely compromised, which is the exact reality the studio spent millions of dollars trying to scrub from the public consciousness. The race crossed through dozens of small towns, school zones, and quiet rural communities where everyday people were just trying to commute. While the racers viewed themselves as modern-day cowboys, reclaiming the freedom of the open road from the newly imposed 55-mile-per-hour federal speed limit, the reality on the ground was far more sinister. They were effectively firing a 3-ton kinetic missile through the public square, crossing state lines without an ounce of institutional oversight. The local sheriffs and state troopers weren't the bumbling, slow-witted comic relief characters portrayed in the final film. They were heavily armed lawmen who grew increasingly furious and desperate to stop what they viewed as a recurring, lawless invasion of their jurisdictions. High-speed spike strips, improvised roadblocks, and tense, hostile standoffs on the side of rural highways were part of the regular landscape. The real race was a volatile powder keg of anti-authoritarian rage, high-speed recklessness, and an underlying ambient terror that someone, eventually, was going to cause a catastrophic mass casualty event on the American highway system. The studio knew that if audiences saw the true, unvarnished recklessness of this subculture, they wouldn't laugh. They would be horrified by the sheer disregard for human life. But Asphalt doesn't care about a punchline. When Cannonball was cold-blooded. It's vital to look at the cinematic landscape of the late 70s to grasp how close the Cannonball Run came to being an entirely different beast. Hollywood wasn't always obsessed with sanitized, 4-quadrant family comedies. Before the studio stepped in with a mountain of cash and a mandate for star-studded slapstick, the raw, cinematic language of cross-country racing was soaked in grease, sweat, and genuine malice. There was a lost blueprint for this movie, a shadow script that aligned far more with the grim, cynical reality of the open road than the cartoon we eventually received. The original creative impulse surrounding the outlaw race wasn't to make people laugh, it was to make them sweat. In the years leading up to the 1981 film, the template for the American car movie was defined by the exploitation genre. These weren't lighthearted romps, they were high-octane thrillers, where cars were treated as deadly weapons and the highway was a lawless wasteland. Consider the cultural context established by Roger Corman's Cannonballs, 1976. Released just 5 years before the Burt Reynolds version, this film starred David Carradine and offered a completely unvarnished, deeply cynical take on the exact same premise. In Corman's vision of the cross-country race, there was no friendly camaraderie among the drivers. There were no lovable rogues sharing a beer at a pit stop. Instead, the competitors were cutthroat sociopaths who would actively try to murder each other for a cash prize. They used guns, deliberately forced rival vehicles off cliffs into fiery explosions, and viewed human life as entirely expendable. This darker approach wasn't an anomaly, it was the standard. The late 70s gave us Death Race 2000 and The Car, movies that treated the automobile not as a symbol of freedom and fun, but as an instrument of terror and destruction. When the initial concepts for a definitive movie based on Brock Yates's real-life Cannonball race began circulating, the momentum was heavily weighted toward this gritty, high-stakes realism. The early treatments didn't feature a wacky superhero alter ego like Captain Chaos, nor did they feature a bumbling tech genius driving a high-tech gadget car. They focused on desperate men fleeing broken lives, career criminals using the race as a cover to move contraband across state lines, and drivers who were one sleepless night away from a total psychological breakdown. The studio executives at 20th Century Fox, however, looked at this raw material and saw a massive financial liability. They recognized that the American public in 1981 was shifting away from the dark, paranoid cinema of the post-Vietnam era and moving toward escapism. More importantly, they realized that a realistic depiction of an illegal cross-country race would face massive pushback from insurance companies, highway safety advocates, and conservative parental groups. If the movie showed the true cold-blooded nature of the competition, where drivers routinely endangered families on their morning commutes and viewed the law with utter contempt, it would be a public relations nightmare. The decision was made to systematically file down the sharp edges of the script, transforming a story about reckless, antisocial speed demons into a star-studded variety show on wheels. This corporate sterilization process meant erasing the foundational tension of the narrative. In the unproduced concepts, the rivalry between the teams wasn't a series of harmless pranks involving fake medical emergencies or goofy disguises. It was a psychological war of attrition. Teams would deliberately sabotage rival vehicles, contaminate fuel supplies, and leave competitors stranded in the middle of hostile, isolated environments. The ambient threat of the open road was supposed to be a main character, the ever-present realization that a single mechanical failure in the middle of the night meant being utterly alone in a vast, uncaring continent. The original vision aimed to capture the true, gritty isolation of long-haul driving, the greasy diner food, the smell of burning oil, and the constant, low-humming anxiety of knowing that the next flashing blue light in your rearview mirror could mean a permanent prison sentence. By stripping away this cold-blooded competitive edge, the studio didn't just change the tone, they fundamentally altered the morality of the story. They took an event that was inherently selfish, dangerous, and legally compromised, and wrapped it in a warm blanket of celebrity charisma. They brought in a cast of beloved Hollywood heavyweights, Burt Reynolds, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and Farrah Fawcett, to act as human shields against any potential moral outrage. It is hard for an audience to condemn a highly illegal, public-endangering street race when the people doing it are cracking jokes and flashing million-dollar smiles. This was the ultimate studio erasure. They didn't just cut scenes, they killed an entire genre's approach to the material, burying the cold, hard reality of the outlaw highway beneath a mountain of expensive Hollywood charm. Who pays the price when the cameras start rolling? The turning point. The crash that broke the comedy. The studio's carefully constructed illusion of a harmless, high-speed romp didn't just vanish during the writing phase, it completely shattered on a bleak stretch of asphalt outside Las Vegas. While the executives were busy manufacturing a lighthearted atmosphere of celebrity fun, the physical reality of human flesh meeting tons of tearing metal caught up with the production. If you want to know why the final cut of the Cannonball Run feels so aggressively forced in its comedy, it's because the filmmakers were desperately running away from a real-world horror that occurred right in front of their cameras. It was an event so devastating that it permanently altered lives, rewrote Hollywood safety protocols, and cast a dark, inescapable shadow over the entire set. The tragedy centered around Heidi von Beltz, a vibrant 24-year-old world-class athlete and aspiring actress who had been hired as a stunt double for the production. On the second day of second unit filming, she was placed in the passenger seat of a modified red 1980 Aston Martin. The script called for a classic, high-octane Hollywood chase sequence, the exotic sports car weaving through oncoming traffic to evade local law enforcement. It was supposed to be standard, routine stunt work for an action comedy. But on this particular day, the production was operating under the chaotic, corner-cutting pressure that often plagues high-budget car films. The Aston Martin she was riding in wasn't a pristine factory-spec machine. It was a mechanically compromised vehicle with a history of steering issues. Worse yet, the car had been completely stripped of its basic safety equipment to accommodate the cameras. There were no 5-point racing harnesses. There were no heavy-duty roll cages. There weren't even standard factory lap belts. During the execution of a high-speed maneuver, the driver lost control of the temperamental sports car. The Aston Martin swerved violently across the road, completely missing its intended trajectory, and slammed head-on into an oncoming full-sized production van. The kinetic energy of the impact was catastrophic. Without a single restraint to hold her in place, Von Beltz was violently thrown forward, her body absorbing the full, unrestrained force of the collision. The impact instantly fractured her cervical vertebrae, severing her spinal cord and leaving her permanently paralyzed from the neck down. In a single, horrifying second, the lighthearted car movie became the site of a profound, life-altering human tragedy. The atmosphere on the set changed overnight. The carefree, party-like environment that Burt Reynolds and director Hal Needham were famous for creating was instantly replaced by a tense, somber, and legally fraught panic. The reality of what they were actually doing, firing heavy machines down public roads for the amusement of a movie theater audience, could no longer be denied. The production didn't shut down, but the creative energy shifted entirely. The filmmakers were suddenly caught in a massive moral paradox. They were making a movie that told the audience that high-speed, reckless driving was a fun, consequence-free game, while a member of their own crew lay in a hospital bed with a destroyed body because of that exact premise. This is the precise moment where the studio's mandate for aggressive editing and tone shifting became a matter of corporate survival. They knew they couldn't release a movie that had even a hint of genuine danger, grit, or realism anymore. If the driving sequences looked too intense, if the crashes felt too violent, or if the tone dipped even slightly into the cynical, the audience would immediately connect the on-screen action to the real-world tragedy bleeding through the headlines. The studio needed to completely erase the blood from the asphalt. They turned to the editing room not just to construct a narrative, but to build a massive, colorful smokescreen. The solution was to lean into pure, unadulterated slapstick cartoonishness. Every single car chase, every near miss, and every crash was deliberately edited to feel as bloodless and detached from reality as a Saturday morning cartoon. If a car flipped, the editors made sure to immediately cut to a shot of the drivers stumbling out, dusting themselves off, and cracking a joke to reassure the viewer that nobody ever truly gets hurt on the open road. The dangerous, high-stakes kinetic energy that defined late 70s car cinema was systematically purged from the timeline. They stuffed the movie with goofy sound effects, sped-up footage, and over-the-top character reactions specifically to dull the audience's senses. The frantic, almost desperate cheerfulness of the final film wasn't an artistic choice. It was a psychological defense mechanism designed to make the public forget that a young woman's life had been completely destroyed just to put those frames on the screen. How do you sell a product born from a tragedy? The Hollywood Polish. How the edge was filed down. To turn a real-world tragedy and an illegal, public endangering race into a marketable summer blockbuster, the studio executives at 20th Century Fox had to weaponize the editing room. This wasn't standard post-production smoothing. It was a scorched earth campaign against any scene, line, or frame that carried a hint of genuine grit. The mandate from the top floor was absolute. The film had to be entirely bloodless, relentlessly cheerful, and detached from the sweaty, dangerous reality of its source material. The studio accomplished this by pioneering an editing style that effectively treated heavy, lethal machinery like inflatable toys, and the characters driving them like untouchable demigods. The primary tool in this corporate sterilization process was the aggressive manipulation of pacing and tone. In the original script, drafts, and early assembly cuts, the driving sequences had weight. You could hear the strain of the engines, the terrifying squeal of tires on the edge of adhesion, and the cold, isolated hum of the highway at night. The studio systematically stripped these auditory and visual cues away. Instead of letting the audience feel the visceral, white-knuckle terror of a 3-ton vehicle barreling down a dark road at 160 miles per hour, the editors overlaid the action with a jaunty, upbeat country pop soundtrack. They utilized rapid, disorienting cuts to prevent the viewer from lingering on the physical impact of the cars. If a vehicle drifted dangerously close to a civilian car, the scene was instantly cut to a reaction shot of a celebrity laughing, a technique explicitly designed to signal to the audience that everything was under control. This editing philosophy gave birth to one of the movie's most famous, yet deeply artificial elements, the closing credit blooper reel. Director Hal Needham is often credited with inventing the modern movie credit outtake, using it to show Burt Reynolds, Dom DeLuise, and the rest of the cast breaking character, ruining lines, and collapsing into fits of laughter. While audiences found this charmingly authentic, the strategic placement of these bloopers served a much colder corporate purpose. It was the ultimate narrative palate cleanser. by ending the film with a literal montage of the actors laughing at how fake the movie was. The studio erected a massive barrier between the viewer and the real-world dangers of the production. It was a meta-narrative shield that screamed, "Don't worry, none of this is real, nobody got hurt, and it's all just a big, expensive party." Beyond the structural editing, the studio enacted a massive narrative erasure regarding the film's adult themes. The real Cannonball race was deeply embedded in the counterculture of the 70s, a gritty world of cheap motel rooms, casual substance abuse used to fight off sleep deprivation, and a raw, often vulgar, anti-authoritarian attitude. Early iterations of the film featured much heavier adult dialogue and situations that reflected the unvarnished reality of outlaw drivers. The studio executives systematically filed these down, targeting a family-friendly PG rating that would maximize box office returns. They watered down the dialogue, replaced genuine grit with cartoonish double entendres, and transformed a story about law-breaking renegades into a toothless variety show. This sterilization became even more aggressive when the Cannonball Run transitioned from movie theaters to late 80s television syndication. Network censors and studio editors went back into the master tapes with a meat cleaver, cutting out entire blocks of dialogue, suggestive joke, and politically incorrect banter to ensure the film could be broadcast on a lazy Sunday afternoon without upsetting advertisers. The film was compressed, truncated, and fundamentally reshaped until any lingering traces of its late 70s exploitation roots were completely eradicated. What remained was a hyper-sanitized, safe-for-work product that bore almost no resemblance to the volatile, dangerous reality of the open road. The studio didn't just edit a movie, they successfully rewrote the history of the event, convincing a generation of moviegoers that a highly illegal public safety nightmare was actually the most wholesome fun a family could have at the theater. Alcohol, ego, and the cast's downward spiral. To truly understand how the studio manufactured a wholesome summer blockbuster out of raw chaos, you have to look past the marquee names and examine the actual human condition of the actors on that set. The on-screen camaraderie was a carefully edited illusion. In reality, the set of the Cannonball Run was a toxic, booze-fueled carnival where fading legends, desperate movie stars, and exploited icons collided in a haze of professional apathy and personal crisis. The studio didn't just file down the edges of the script. They had to constantly manage a cast that was actively disintegrating behind the scenes, using the production as a high-priced playground while a genuine tragedy unfolded just out of frame. At the center of this orbit was Burt Reynolds, who at the time was the undisputed king of the worldwide box office. Reynolds was at a volatile turning point in his career, trapped in a golden cage of his own making. He was growing deeply frustrated by being pigeonholed into low-brow, southern-fried car comedies, yet he couldn't resist the massive, historic $5 million paycheck the studio threw at him for just a few weeks of work. To cope with the creative stagnation, Reynolds treated the set like a personal kingdom, demanding total control and bringing his high-profile real-life girlfriend, Farrah Fawcett, into the production. Fawcett, desperately trying to break away from her Charlie's Angels pinup image and establish herself as a serious, dramatic actress, found herself relegated to playing a literal prop, a dizzy, easily manipulated organic filler character who existed solely to look beautiful next to Reynolds' smug protagonist. The psychological tension between the two was palpable, turning their on-screen romance into a stiff, performative mask for a relationship that was already beginning to fracture under the weight of Hollywood ego. Worse still was the state of the film's legendary supporting cast. To provide a sense of old-school Hollywood prestige, the filmmakers recruited Rat Pack icons Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. to play a pair of scam artist racers disguised as Catholic priests. But the prestige was purely a marketing gimmick. By 1981, both Martin and Davis Jr. were well past their prime, battle-scarred by decades of hard living, substance abuse, and shifting cultural tastes. On the set of the Cannonball Run, they weren't acting, they were surviving. Production logs and crew testimonies paint a grim picture of two entertainment titans who were openly, chronically intoxicated from morning until wrapped. They treated the entire shoot as a paid vacation, showing up to set with solo cups filled with booze, routinely slurring their lines, and forcing director Hal Needham to shoot around their cognitive impairments. The studio editors had to meticulously splice together microseconds of clarity just to create the illusion that these two legends were lucidly participating in a comedy, burying the depressing reality of their cognitive decline beneath quick cuts and loud laugh tracks. The aftermath of the film offers a grim postscript to the sunny, consequence-free narrative the studio sold to the public. For nearly everyone involved, the Cannonball Run marked the absolute peak of their cultural relevance before a long, painful descent. Burt Reynolds' reign at the top of Hollywood effectively ended shortly after the franchise ran its course. A series of catastrophic box office bombs, combined with a horrific jaw injury on a later set that led to a crippling addiction to prescription painkillers, sent his career into a tailspin from which he never truly recovered, culminating in a highly publicized bankruptcy in the 90s. Farrah Fawcett's career suffered a massive setback from the film's regressive typecasting, forcing her to spend years in creative exile before finally clawing her way back to respectability via gritty television movies. For the Rat Pack duo, the open road led straight to the end of the line. Sammy Davis Jr. spent his remaining years battling mounting financial debts and deteriorating health, eventually succumbing to throat cancer in 1990 after losing his ability to speak. Dean Martin drifted deeper into isolation and profound grief following the tragic death of his son in a 1987 plane crash, spending his final years as a reclusive ghost of his former self before passing away on Christmas Day in 1995. Even Dom DeLuise, who played the cartoonish Captain Chaos, found himself permanently trapped in the shadow of the film's low-brow slapstick, unable to find serious, dramatic work. The studio managed to capture lightning in a bottle for a single summer weekend, but the human cost of that toxic, high-speed party rippled outward for decades, leaving a trail of broken relationships, ruined health, and faded glory in its wake. But why does the myth of the open road still hold us hostage? The Outlaw Mark. Despite the studio's best efforts to edit, sanitize, and bleach the dangerous reality out of the final print, the underlying lawlessness of the American highway system still bleeds through the celluloid. You can scrub the script, you can fill the screen with beloved television icons, and you can mask a horrific on-set tragedy with a jaunty country music score. But you cannot entirely erase the raw, magnetic pull of the open road. The film stands as a bizarre monument to a specific, transitory moment in American car culture, a time when the frontier hadn't yet been completely tamed by modern surveillance, GPS tracking, and corporate liability. By attempting to bury the dark side of the race, the studio accidentally created a pristine, immortalized myth that continues to inspire reckless behavior on public roads to this day. By wrapping the illegal race in a warm blanket of consequence-free Hollywood comedy, the film effectively acted as a recruitment video for generations of speed addicts. It transformed what should have been viewed as a highly selfish, dangerous act of public endangerment into the ultimate expression of American individual liberty. In the decades following the movie's release, the real-world Cannonball race didn't actually die. It just went deeper underground, evolving into an obsessed subculture of wealthy drivers competing in what they call the fraternity of the coast. These modern-day racers don't look like Burt Reynolds or Dom DeLuise, but they carry the exact same disregard for public safety that the studio spent millions trying to obscure. Armed with high-tech police scanners, thermal imaging cameras, and modified sports cars with massive fuel cells, they continue to blast across the United States, desperately chasing the ghost of a movie that was heavily edited to hide the true cost of their obsession. This ongoing real-world legacy reveals the profound danger of Hollywood's sanitization process. When you file down the edges of a genuinely dark, high-stakes reality to make it safe for mass consumption, you create a false narrative that people try to recreate in the real world. The audience never sees the broken bodies, the terrified families forced off rural two-lane highways, or the psychological trauma of a driver who realizes too late that a patch of black ice travels faster than human reflexes. They only see the million-dollar smiles of movie stars crossing an imaginary finish line without a scratch on them. The Cannonball Run succeeded wildly at the box office because it gave the public exactly what they wanted: a harmless fantasy of rebellion where nobody ever truly gets hurt, and the law is just a bumbling obstacle to be outsmarted. But as the real-world timers continue to click on the asphalt between New York and Los Angeles, the erased version of the story remains the only one that tells the truth. The dark, cynical, and violent blueprint that the studio executives were so desperate to bury wasn't a distortion of the event. It was an accurate reflection of it. The real cross-country run was a brutal, cold-blooded war of attrition, fought on a dangerous public stage, born out of a volatile mix of anti-authoritarian rage and mechanical recklessness. The studio successfully managed to hide that beast behind a wall of expensive slapstick and celebrity charm, proving that in Hollywood, the easiest way to make a tragedy disappear is to turn it into a comedy. If you want to see the real stories behind Hollywood's biggest movies, don't forget to subscribe.